If you step through those doors, David, you seal the doom of us both, Luna warned, her voice barely a whisper against the relentless autumn thunder rattling the estate's towering windows. David paused, his knuckles turning stark white as his hand gripped the heavy oak handle of the council chamber. The blackened veins of the affliction pulsed violently beneath the crisp collar of his shirt, a venomous ivy choking his pulse and threatening his sanity. They demand an answer, Luna. The northern borders are completely fracturing. They demand a puppet, she countered, stepping into his space, her unwavering gaze acting as an anchor. If we do not buy enough time, the Alpha King's secret mate, breaking the ancient blood curse, will remain a forgotten, tragic myth. And you will become exactly the mindless monster they need you to be. The subterranean archives of the Silverwood estate smelled distinctively of aging parchment, damp limestone, and the sterile ozone tang of modern dehumidifiers humming endlessly in the shadowed corners. It was a space suspended between centuries, where servers housing encrypted digital mainframes sat alongside fragile, leather-bound ledgers dating back to the first lupine settlements. Luna adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, leaning over a massive mahogany table. The solitary brass desk lamp cast a warm, golden circle in the otherwise cavernous, ink-black room. Outside, rain battered the high, narrow ground-level windows, a muffled percussion to the sprawling, opulent operations functioning just above her head. Luna Thorne was an anomaly within the Silverwood territory. She possessed no heightened senses, no predatory grace, and absolutely no wolf blood. Her presence was a direct, highly controversial result of the Integration Accord, a progressive treaty David had aggressively championed 2 years prior to bridge the widening gap between the modern human financial world and the isolated, ancient wealth of the Pax. Officially, she was tasked with digitizing the territorial trade agreements, a mundane job deemed suitable for a scentless human with zero political standing. Yet, for the past 3 weeks, her meticulous attention had been entirely consumed by a terrifying discrepancy she had unearthed while tracing the estate's pharmaceutical import routes. It was a heavily guarded secret within the upper echelons of the estate that the Alpha King was gravely unwell. The official narrative, curated carefully by the Council of Elders, suggested David was merely exhausted by the crushing weight of economic transition. But the hushed, frightened rumors filtering down to the archives spoke of the ancient blood curse. It was a genetic degradation said to historically strike the ruling bloodline under immense stress, turning the sovereign feral, emotionally barren, and eventually violently mad. The symptoms were undeniable: a dark, creeping necrosis under the skin and a profound loss of empathy. Luna, however, trusted numbers far more than she trusted mythology. Her slender finger traced a faded ink entry from a decade ago, then tapped the glowing screen of her tablet displaying the current quarter's supply chain. A shell company, quietly registered under a subsidiary managed by Elder Vance's Eastern Territory, had drastically increased its shipments to the Royal Wing. The manifests legally labeled the cargo as purified incense resin for the grand ceremonial halls. But Luna had spent her university years studying chemical trade regulations. The molecular weight, the highly specialized, temperature-controlled shipping conditions, and the transit origins did not match tree resin. They perfectly matched refined Aconitum napellus, wolfsbane, and not just any common, wild-grown wolfsbane. The transit route indicated a highly specific, slow-acting eastern strain. When processed and introduced to the lupine nervous system over a prolonged period, it didn't kill immediately. It bonded to their genetic markers, triggering severe neurological misfires that perfectly mimicked the degenerative symptoms of the blood curse. Luna's breath hitched in the quiet room. Someone sitting on the highest council was methodically, untraceably poisoning the Alpha King. They weren't just waiting for him to fall. They were artificially accelerating his descent into madness. According to pack law, a feral king could be legally stripped of his crown through the archaic right of regency, transferring absolute power to the council. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud and frantic, as the sheer scale of the treason settled like ice in her stomach. If Vance discovered she possessed this digital trail, her human status would offer zero protection. She would simply disappear. "You are down here incredibly late, Miss Thorne." The voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to bypass the air and vibrate directly through the concrete floorboards beneath her feet. Luna gasped sharply, her hand instinctively flattening over the glowing screen of her tablet. She spun around, her chair squeaking loudly in the dead silence, to find David standing perfectly still in the stone archway. Even leaning casually against the ancient stone frame, the Alpha King commanded the physical space with a suffocating, gravitational pull. David wore a tailored charcoal suit that perfectly emphasized the broad, imposing line of his shoulders, though the dark silk tie was loosened, and the top button of his shirt undone as if he had been physically fighting for air. But it was his face that arrested her breath. He possessed the handsome, aristocratic angles characteristic of his bloodline, yet his skin was alarmingly pale, heavily shadowed with bone-deep exhaustion. His piercing amber eyes locked onto hers. He wasn't merely looking at her. He was analyzing her spike in heart rate, the shift in her scent, missing absolutely nothing. "Your Majesty?" Luna breathed, hastily pushing herself up and dropping into a respectful, albeit clumsy, boop. "I apologize. I didn't hear the elevator. I was just finalizing the quarterly indexing for the Northern Territories." David pushed off the doorframe. His heavy leather boots made no sound as he slowly closed the distance between them, a silent predator stalking through the stacks. As he stepped into the direct, unforgiving light of her desk lamp, Luna forced herself not to flinch. The rumors were entirely accurate. Faint, dark, spiderweb-like lines branched up the side of his strong neck, disappearing into his collar. The curse, or, as she now knew with terrifying certainty, the necrosis of the poison fighting his cellular structure. "You are a truly terrible liar, Luna," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, stopping just on the other side of the heavy mahogany table. He used her first name, a distinct breach of formal protocol that sent a strange, involuntary shiver racing down her spine. "The quarterly indices are managed by the automated systems on the 3rd floor. This subterranean level houses only restricted pack histories and dead accounts." He leaned forward gracefully, bracing his large, calloused hands on the edge of the table. The sudden proximity was overwhelmingly intoxicating. Despite his illness, he radiated a crisp, clean scent of winter pine and ozone, though it was deeply undercut by the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed physical agony. "I will ask you once, and I expect the absolute truth," David continued, his amber eyes pinning her in place. "What is my quiet, unassuming human archivist found in the dark that makes her heart race fast enough for me to hear it echoing from the corridor?" Luna swallowed hard, looking from his intense, demanding gaze down to her hand covering the tablet. The survival instincts ingrained in her screamed to deflect, to apologize, to pack her things and resign by morning. Stepping into a lethal game of high-stakes pack politics meant painting a target on her own back. Vance was a ruthless traditionalist who openly despised the Integration Accord. He would view a human's interference as a deeply offensive pest control issue, but as she looked back up at the dark, poisoned veins marring David's skin, She didn't see a feral monster. She saw a profoundly isolated leader, slowly suffocating under the weight of an invisible war, silently searching for a single trustworthy ally in a house full of traitors. She made her choice. Luna slowly slid her hand away from the screen, tapping the illuminated, cross-referenced shipping manifest, and turned the tablet around to face him. "I found a ghost in your supply chain, David," she replied softly, intentionally matching his dangerous breach of protocol with a quiet, steely defiance. "And it is currently sitting on your Council of Elders, patiently poisoning the soil of your home while waiting for you to die." The heavy, charged silence that followed was louder than thunder. David stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening until the muscles feathered. In that quiet, subterranean room, an inescapable, dangerous bond cemented between them. Two outcasts in a kingdom of predators, armed only with a ledger and a lethal truth. High above the damp archives, the Alpha King's private study in the royal wing was a masterclass in modern, isolated luxury. Floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass overlooked the sprawling, rain-slicked city that bordered the Silverwood territory. It was a sea of glittering human lights that felt entirely alien to the ancient, volatile power currently coursing through David's veins. He stood by the window, a heavy crystal tumbler of aged bourbon forgotten in his grip. A sudden, violent tremor racked his broad frame. The pain was excruciating, a searing, white-hot agony that started at the base of his spine and clawed its way up into his chest cavity. He staggered backward, dropping the tumbler. It shattered against the polished mahogany floorboards, the expensive amber liquid pooling like dark blood. He gripped the edge of his massive desk, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed his eyes shut. The blackened veins surged fiercely beneath his skin, choking his breath, making his vision swim with crimson static. He was losing the battle. Knowing the curse was artificially induced by Vance's refined aconite offered a strategic advantage, but it provided zero immediate physical relief. The poison had been accumulating in his system for months, expertly masked, binding itself to the very lupine DNA that gave him his strength. His inner wolf, usually a source of immense grounding and power, was thrashing wildly in the dark, confused and enraged by the toxic fog suffocating them. If he lost control here, if the beast breached the surface, the royal guard stationed outside would report the feral shift. Vance would have all the legal proof needed to execute the right of regency by morning. A soft, hesitant knock echoed through the heavy oak door. Before David could grind out a command to stay away, the door creaked open. Luna stepped inside, her arms laden with the encrypted historical maps and the original ledgers they needed to build their case against the Elder. She paused instantly, sensing the drastic shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The sharp scent of spilled bourbon mixed heavily with the undeniable metallic odor of predatory distress. Her wide eyes darted from the shattered glass to David, who was hunched entirely over his desk, his breathing violently ragged, his chest heaving. The composed, terrifyingly stoic king from the archives was completely gone, replaced by a man drowning in his own biology. Luna dropped the heavy stack of documents onto a nearby leather sofa, abandoning all pretense of caution. She didn't turn to summon the guards, knowing full well that exposing his weakness was exactly what the conspirators desired. Her sensible shoes crunched softly on the edge of the shattered crystal as she hurried across the spacious room. "David, look at me," she urged, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. "What do you need me to do?" He could only shake his head violently, a low, guttural, terrifyingly inhuman growl vibrating deep within his chest as another devastating wave of crippling pain hit. His grip on the mahogany desk finally gave out, his knees buckling beneath his immense weight. Luna caught him. It was a desperate, entirely unthinking human reaction. She lunged forward, throwing her slender arms around his broad, shaking shoulders to brace his fall, letting his weight drag them both down to the plush, carpeted floor. The exact moment her bare hands pressed firmly against the heated, damp skin of his neck, the world seemed to violently fracture and stitch itself back together. It wasn't magic. It was a profound, explosive biological shockwave. An inexplicable, resonant pulse of brilliant, grounding energy seemed to originate from the very core of Luna's chest, flooding through her palms directly into his nervous system. Her human essence, completely void of the lupine genetic markers that the aconite specifically targeted, acted as an absolute grounding rod. The toxic static ravaging his cells was violently pulled away, neutralized by the pure, uncorrupted quiet of her humanity. David gasped loudly, his amber eyes flying wide open in unadulterated shock. The agonizing fire in his veins didn't just lessen. It violently receded. The blackened, poisoned veins, visible on his neck, began to rapidly fade, shrinking back beneath the surface until only smooth, heated flesh remained. The sudden, absolute absence of pain left him dizzy, but the clarity that rushed back into his mind was blindingly sharp. His wolf, moments ago feral and dying in the dark, was suddenly sitting at rapt attention, purring a singular, impossible, ancient word directly into his consciousness. "Mate." He stared up at Luna. She was kneeling over him, her chest heaving, her hands still resting gently, almost reverently, on his skin. She looked equally stunned, staring at her own palms as if she didn't recognize them. The forgotten lore of the pack archives spoke of a secret mate, a fated counterpart whose very cellular resonance could neutralize the ultimate corruption of the bloodline. Such tales were dismissed as romanticized, impossible myths meant to comfort dying kings. Yet, as David breathed in the sweet, clean scent of rain and cedar radiating from her pulse points, feeling the steady, flawless rhythm of his own heart, he knew with absolute certainty that the myth had just saved his life. The grand boardroom of the Silverwood estate was a masterclass in architectural intimidation, designed specifically over centuries to make anyone standing before the Council of Elders feel insignificantly small. Massive vaulted ceilings, frescoed with the violent, historical victories of the founding packs, loomed oppressively over a long, polished obsidian table. At the head of this table sat David. He projected an aura of absolute, terrifying control. Unlike the sweating, trembling man who had collapsed in his private study merely 12 hours prior, the Alpha King currently looked radiant. His posture was immaculate, his broad shoulders relaxed into the high-backed leather chair, and his amber eyes were sharp, missing absolutely nothing. Standing quietly in the shadowy corner of the expansive room, a sleek digital tablet clutched securely to her chest, was Luna. Officially, she was attending in her newly minted, highly controversial role as his executive liaison, tasked with taking the minutes of the morning's proceedings. Unofficially, she was his biological lifeline. Their physical proximity alone, though separated by several feet of polished stone floor, was just enough to maintain the grounding resonance that kept the lingering, toxic fog of the refined wolfsbane at bay in his bloodstream. Across the vast obsidian table, Elder Vance shifted uncomfortably. Vance was a shrewd, aging wolf with calculating silver eyes and a meticulously groomed gray beard that hid a multitude of sins. He had walked into the boardroom that morning expecting to find a sovereign on the absolute brink of a feral collapse, a fractured king ready to be gently but firmly maneuvered into stepping down. Instead, he found an alpha radiating pure, lethal vitality. The stark contrast was visibly jarring the elder's usually unshakable composure. "Your Majesty, it is deeply reassuring to see you looking so robust this morning," Vance began, his voice dripping with a carefully measured, faux solicitous tone. His silver eyes darted momentarily toward Luna in the corner, a flash of profound irritation crossing his weathered features before he refocused on David. However, the Council remains gravely concerned about the long-term stability of the bloodline. Given the recent, undeniable fluctuations in your health, we must strongly insist you formally select a highborn mate at the upcoming Blood Moon Gala. My niece, Serafina, has already expressed her deepest willingness to serve the pack in this vital, ancestral capacity. Luna's fingers tightened unconsciously around her tablet, her knuckles turning white. The sheer audacity of the man was mathematically staggering. He was actively poisoning David, methodically attempting to drive him into madness, and simultaneously attempting to marry his own niece into the royal bloodline to secure ultimate control over the entire Silverwood territory. It was a flawless, bloodless coup. Luna kept her expression perfectly blank, utilizing her years of professional invisibility, while masking the sudden surge of protective anger flaring hot in her chest. She watched David carefully, bracing for the explosive, feral rage the Aconite was specifically designed to induce. Instead, David leaned back in his chair, slowly tenting his powerful fingers together. A cold, dangerously serene smile played at the corners of his mouth. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch out, weaponizing the quiet until the atmospheric pressure in the massive room felt heavy enough to crush human bone. The other minor elders exchanged nervous, shifting glances, entirely unprepared for this calculating, deeply composed version of their king. They were waiting for a beast. They were faced with a grandmaster chess player. I appreciate your profound dedication to my personal life, Elder Vance, David finally replied, his deep baritone carrying effortlessly across the cavernous space. And I certainly look forward to the traditional festivities of the Blood Moon Gala. However, before we concern ourselves with marital politics, I believe we have far more pressing internal administrative matters to address. He paused, lowering his hands to the table, his amber eyes locking directly onto Vance's silver ones. The invisible tether between David and Luna seemed to hum with anticipated energy. My new executive liaison, Miss Thorne, has been conducting a remarkably thorough audit of our recent territorial shipping manifests. David continued, his tone perfectly even, almost conversational. We have noted several alarming, multi-million-dollar discrepancies regarding the importation of certain botanical resins from your Eastern Shell companies. It appears the royal estate is drastically overpaying for highly specialized agricultural supplies we do not fundamentally require. I have authorized a full, independent financial investigation into the transit origins of these specific deliveries. The physical effect on the room was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. All the color rapidly drained from Elder Vance's face, leaving his skin looking ashen and incredibly frail. He opened his mouth to formulate a defensive, blustering response, but the words seemed to turn to ash in his throat. David had expertly played the exact card Luna had given him. He utilized the information without overtly accusing Vance of high treason or attempted regicide, an accusation that, without undeniable physical proof, would instantly ignite a bloody civil war within the pack. Instead, David had firmly, surgically placed the elder on notice. He knew, and Vance now knew that he knew. The power dynamic in the room had flawlessly, violently shifted back into the Alpha King's absolute control. We will review the preliminary audit findings tomorrow, David announced softly, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket in one fluid, authoritative motion. Dismissed. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak boardroom doors were locked, leaving David and Luna completely alone in the massive space. The stoic, terrifying mask of the king melted away instantly. David let out a long, heavy exhale, running a calloused hand through his dark hair as the sheer mental exertion of suppressing his wolf's aggressive instincts took its toll. He turned to look at Luna. The immense physical distance between them in the empty hall felt suddenly, painfully charged with an entirely different kind of tension. Luna stepped out of the shadows, her sensible shoes clicking softly against the marble as she walked toward the head of the table. "You played that perfectly," she whispered, the quiet intimacy of her voice offering a stark contrast to the vast, cold room. "He is terrified, David. He knows his timeline has been completely shattered." David closed the remaining distance between them, stopping mere inches away. The scent of ozone and winter pine wrapped around her, warm and overwhelmingly safe. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the curve of her cheek, a gesture so tender and unexpected, her heart stumbled in its rhythm. "I played it perfectly," he corrected softly, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, possessive warmth that stole the breath from her lungs. "Because I had my fated mate standing in my corner." The transition from the obscure, damp, subterranean archives to the opulent royal wing was jarring, to say the least. Luna's new assigned quarters were a sprawling masterclass in understated, historical luxury. The room featured rich, velvet draperies that pooled on the polished hardwood floors, a massive four-poster bed draped in Egyptian cotton, and a private, stone-carved balcony overlooking the estate's immaculately manicured eastern gardens. But the most significant and deeply terrifying feature of the spacious room was the heavy, brass-studded mahogany door set into the far wall. It connected directly to the Alpha King's private chambers. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of her new, inescapable reality. As Luna carefully unpacked her modest, sensible clothing into the massive cedar armoire, the sheer gravity of her situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. She was no longer a hidden observer, buried in historical text. She was the central, fragile anchor, holding back a kingdom's total ruin. "The perimeter is entirely secure, Miss Thorne. Though I must admit, your sudden, unprecedented promotion has the entire royal guard thoroughly bewildered." The voice belonged to Silas, the captain of the royal guard, who was currently leaning casually against the open door frame of her suite. He was a towering, heavily scarred wolf with eyes the color of chipped winter ice, exuding a quiet, lethal competence. David had briefly introduced them earlier that afternoon, explicitly commanding Silas to protect Luna with his own life. Silas had accepted the absolute order with a stiff, formal bow, but his sharp gaze had lingered on her ever since, clearly searching for the hidden, extraordinary strength that had earned a seemingly ordinary, scentless human such a vital position. Luna offered him a polite, carefully measured smile, smoothing a non-existent crease in her simple wool skirt. "I assure you, Captain, I am just as bewildered by the administrative shift. But the king requires an archivist who intimately understands the logistical nuances of the eastern shipping routes. I am simply serving the pack where my specific skill set is most needed." She kept her tone perfectly even, projecting a calm, unbothered facade that completely belied her racing pulse. Silas simply nodded slowly, pushing off the doorframe, his heavy boots making no sound. "Just remember, Miss Thorne, the upper levels of this estate operate on an entirely different set of rules. Down in the archives, you were safely invisible. Up here, every breath you take, every hesitation, is being analyzed for weakness. Trust absolutely no one outside of this specific wing." As Silas departed to check the hallway, The heavy connecting door to David's chambers clicked open. David stepped through, loosening his dark silk tie with one hand. The deep exhaustion from the morning's boardroom confrontation still clung to the sharp angles of his jaw, but the terrifying blackened veins of the poison were thankfully completely absent from his skin. He moved with the fluid, silent grace of an apex predator returning to his den, stopping only when he was within arm's reach of her. The sheer proximity instantly sent a familiar, grounding shockwave of warmth radiating outward from Luna's chest. The invisible tether between them hummed with a quiet, persistent energy, an undeniable biological demand for acknowledgement. "Vance has made his first countermove," David stated quietly. His amber eyes were unreadable, though a muscle feathered in his jaw as he held out a small, exquisite silver tray. Resting atop the polished metal was a single, pristine white lily, a deeply traditional pack symbol of mourning and profound condolences, alongside a beautifully handwritten, wax-sealed invitation to the upcoming Blood Moon Gala. It was delivered directly to your door, entirely bypassing the standard security checkpoints. Silas is currently tearing the staff apart looking for the courier. It is a polite, calculated reminder that Vance's reach extends far past the boardroom, and that he certainly does not view you as a permanent fixture in my life. Luna carefully picked up the lily by the very edge of its stem, the delicate white petals soft against her fingertips. She brought it closer to examine the stalk, her archivist's mind immediately analyzing the physical details. A faint, nearly imperceptible powdery residue dusted the green surface. She sniffed the air cautiously, immediately recognizing the sharp, bitter, highly alkaline scent hiding beneath the flower's natural, heavy fragrance. "It's coated in crushed aconite," Luna whispered, her blood running cold as she carefully placed the flower back onto the silver tray and rigorously wiped her fingers on a handkerchief. Not nearly enough to kill a wolf or even trigger the curse symptoms. Just enough to let you know he can bypass your elite guards whenever he wishes to strike. David's jaw clenched, a low, incredibly dangerous rumble vibrating deep within his chest. The protective, violent instinct of the alpha surged to the surface, warring intensely with the cold, calculating logic of the king. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her wrist, checking the steady rhythm of her pulse with his thumb. The simple physical contact instantly smoothed the harsh, violent lines of tension around his eyes. The grounding effect immediate and profound. "He is attempting to provoke me into an uncalculated, emotional error," David murmured, his voice softening dramatically as he looked down at her, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her inner wrist. He expects the beast to rage, to tear the estate apart looking for his spies, validating his claims of my instability. But he severely underestimates the absolute clarity you have given me, Luna. We will not react. We will attend his gala, we will smile for the cameras, and we will let him blindly walk into the very trap he has built for himself. The resolute, quiet confidence in his deep voice was intoxicating, weaving a profound, undeniable sense of safety around her despite the lethal game they were currently playing. The atmosphere within the Silverwood estate grew increasingly suffocating as the sacred Blood Moon Gala rapidly approached. The sprawling, opulent corridors hummed with a manic, frantic energy as high-end florists, caterers, and minor pack dignitaries flooded the historical grounds. For the general pack, the Blood Moon was a deeply revered, ancient lunar cycle where their primal nature was closest to the surface. For the Council of Elders, it was the perfect, highly public stage to force David's hand regarding his lineage and supposed failing health. Luna found herself sequestered in a lavish, sunlit fitting room on the estate's highly secured second floor, enduring the meticulous, agonizing process of being fitted for an evening gown deemed appropriate for the king's newly appointed executive liaison. It must be terribly overwhelming for you, Miss Thorne. A smooth, cultured, and undeniably venomous voice purred from the open doorway. Luna turned slowly, careful not to disturb the anxious seamstress currently pinning the hem of her midnight blue silk gown. Serafina, Elder Vance's niece, stepped into the room. She was breathtakingly beautiful, moving with the languid, terrifying grace of a stalking feline. Her ice-blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, and her piercing blue eyes swept over Luna's modest frame with a mixture of polite amusement and profound, genetic disdain. To be violently thrust from the dusty, forgotten archives into the brilliant, unforgiving glare of the royal court. Serafina continued, slowly circling the fitting pedestal. One must truly wonder what extraordinary, deeply hidden talents you possess to warrant such a rapid, unprecedented elevation in status. Luna met the high-born she-wolf's predatory gaze with a calm, unblinking composure. She had spent years reading the dense, intricate histories of pack politics and behavioral psychology. She knew exactly how this dangerous game of verbal chess was played. The king simply values thoroughness, Lady Serafina. Luna replied smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely none of the nervous energy fluttering wildly in her stomach. My talents lie entirely in recognizing complex patterns, finding historical discrepancies, and organizing objective truth from fiction. It is entirely unglamorous work, but apparently highly necessary for the current economic stability of the estate. Serafina smiled, a cold, incredibly sharp expression that didn't reach her pale blue eyes. She stepped closer, the heavy, expensive scent of jasmine perfume deliberately attempting to mask the sharp, metallic tang of her aggressive, territorial dominance. Stability is a very fragile illusion, Miss Thorne, especially during a blood moon. The pack requires undeniable strength, tradition, and an alpha pair who intimately understand the ancient, ancestral weight of the crown. A human clerk, no matter how brilliantly she organizes financial ledgers, is a temporary, fleeting amusement. I do hope you understand your fragile place before the pack formally demands a true queen. Before Luna could formulate a polite, cutting response, the heavy wooden doors to the fitting room swung wide open. David strode in, the atmospheric temperature in the room instantly dropping as his massive, dominant presence effortlessly suffocated Serafina's aggressive display. He ignored the high-born female entirely, his amber eyes locking directly onto Luna. The rich, midnight blue silk contrasted beautifully with her pale skin, hugging the gentle curves she usually hid beneath oversized cardigans. A flicker of genuine, raw heat flashed across his usually stoic features, softening the harsh lines of his face. "You look extraordinary, Luna," he stated softly. The intimate, hushed tone of his voice carried perfectly across the dead-silent room, an incredibly deliberate, highly public claiming of her importance. Serafina's smug smile fractured. Her perfect posture stiffened in visible outrage at being so thoroughly, publicly dismissed in favor of a human. "Your Majesty," she interjected sharply, executing a flawless, albeit incredibly tense, curtsy. "We were just discussing the logistical protocols of the impending gala." David finally turned his head. His gaze swept over Serafina with a chilling, absolute indifference that was far more insulting than outright anger. "The gala is a matter of strict pack security, Serafina. My liaison and I have highly pressing matters to discuss regarding the evening's schedule. You may excuse yourself." It was not a request. Serafina's jaw tightened so hard, her teeth audibly ground together. She dipped her head, casting one final venomous look at Luna before sweeping gracefully from the room. the door clicking shut behind her. Once they were entirely alone, the seamstress having wisely fled into the back room, David stepped close. His large hand rested lightly, possessively, on the small of Luna's back. The heat of his palm seared through the thin silk. "The blood moon will significantly amplify the residual poison currently trapped in my blood," he whispered, the earlier warmth in his eyes replaced by a grim, deeply serious reality. "The beast will fight violently to take control to survive the perceived threat. Tomorrow night, no matter what happens, no matter what political theatrics Vance attempts to orchestrate, you cannot let go of my hand." That night, long after the estate had quieted, the profound weight of David's warning kept Luna awake. She slipped away from her heavily guarded quarters, her mind relentlessly chewing on the terrifying logistics of Vance's poison. If the aconite wasn't in the royal food supply, and the ceremonial incense had been officially confiscated weeks ago, how exactly was the elder maintaining the toxic baseline in David's system without detection? She walked slowly down the damp, stone-paved central aisle of the Silverwood Botanical Conservatory, her small flashlight cutting a narrow, pale beam through the dense, humid foliage. The massive glass house was an architectural marvel, housing thousands of rare plants. But tonight, it felt like a shadowy jungle. She stopped before a massive, elaborate display of rare eastern lilies, a recent, highly publicized gift of goodwill from Vance's territory, placed deliberately outside the king's private ventilation intakes. Luna knelt on the damp stone, her fingers digging carefully into the rich, dark soil at the base of the massive ceramic planter. She pulled up a handful of earth, bringing it close to her face. It didn't smell like standard, rich fertilizer. It smelled distinctly sharp, highly alkaline, and bitterly familiar. Vance hadn't poisoned the food. He had laced the very soil of the indoor flora. The estate's advanced, centralized ventilation system was slowly, continuously circulating the microscopic, toxic dust directly into the royal wing. It was a brilliantly subtle, entirely invisible execution. A sharp, unnatural rustle of heavy leaves behind her shattered the quiet ambiance of the conservatory. Luna froze, the damp, poisoned soil slipping through her trembling fingers. She slowly stood up, turning her flashlight toward a dense patch of monstrous ferns. The pale beam caught the unmistakable, horrifying glint of silver eyes reflecting in the dark. A massive, heavily muscled wolf stepped out from the shadows. It was not a royal guard. Its fur was terribly patchy, its jaw slung low, dripping with a thick, rabid mixture of saliva and dark blood. It was a feral, a pack member whose mind had completely snapped, driven utterly mad by the very same lethal poison Vance was using on the king, now weaponized as a deniable, untraceable assassin. The feral snarled, a terrifying, wet, guttural sound that echoed loudly off the high glass ceilings, its powerful hind muscles bunching to spring. Luna took a slow, terrified step backward, her heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She had absolutely no weapon, and outrunning a wolf in an enclosed space was a mathematical impossibility. Just as the beast launched itself forward, a massive, dark blur intercepted it midair. The physical impact was deafening, a brutal, sickening clash of bone and muscle that sent several heavy ceramic planters crashing to the stone floor in a massive shower of dirt and shattered pottery. David stood between her and the feral, entirely in his human form, his powerful hands gripping the rabid beast directly by the throat. The sheer, terrifying, unadulterated strength of the Alpha King was on full display. He didn't roar, and he didn't give in to the frantic, feral rage the poison was meant to induce. He was cold, utterly calculated, and devastatingly precise. With one brutal, sickening twist of his broad shoulders, he snapped the feral's neck, dropping the massive, lifeless body to the damp floor with a heavy thud. He stood over the carcass, his broad chest heaving, his crisp white shirt torn at the shoulder where the beast's desperate claws had grazed him. Luna rushed forward, completely abandoning human logic or fear. Her bare hands immediately pressed against the bleeding, poisoned scratches on his broad shoulder. The exact moment her skin made contact, the familiar, brilliant surge of grounding energy rushed between them. David let out a sharp, ragged breath, the lethal, violent tension draining rapidly from his muscular frame. He turned to her, his amber eyes wide and burning with a fierce, possessive adrenaline. He reached out, his slightly bloodied hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs sweeping reverently across her pale cheekbones. The physical relief her touch provided was absolute, but the emotional gravity of the violent moment was entirely overwhelming. He leaned in, his forehead resting heavily against hers, the chaotic, metallic scent of blood and violence entirely eclipsed by the grounding, profound reality of their fated bond. They will bleed for bringing this danger to you, David vowed, his voice a low, sacred whisper in the dark, shattered glass house. But you found the source, Luna. The puzzle is complete. Tomorrow night, at the gala, we break the curse. The grand ballroom of the Silverwood estate was a staggering architectural masterpiece of vaulted ceilings, gilded mirrors, and towering crystal chandeliers. Yet, on this particular night, the opulent space felt entirely like a meticulously gilded cage. The massive, arched glass skylights spanning the ceiling had been fully retracted, allowing the heavy, oppressive light of the blood moon to wash over the polished white marble floors in a flood of deep, visceral crimson. The atmosphere was incredibly dense, practically vibrating with the primal, tightly coiled energy of hundreds of apex predators forced into close proximity under the influence of their most sacred, volatile lunar cycle. The air was thick and chaotic, a heavy mixture of expensive designer perfumes, sharp colognes, and the undeniable, underlying metallic scent of canine dominance, anxiety, and territorial tension. In the far corner, an elite string quartet played a haunting, classical melody. But the delicate music was entirely drowned out by the low, continuous hum of tense, guarded conversations rippling through the crowd. Luna stood impeccably still beside the elevated royal dais. Her midnight blue silk gown cascaded elegantly around her frame, the rich fabric creating a striking, quiet contrast against the aggressive crimson light flooding the room. She was profoundly, acutely aware of the hundreds of predatory eyes tracking her every single micro-expression. To the traditionalist pack, she was a complete anomaly. A frail, scentless human standing in the most dangerous, highly contested space in the room. But to David, she was the absolute anchor keeping the crushing weight of the lunar cycle from tearing his sanity apart. Per their quiet, desperate agreement in the royal fitting room, they had maintained an unbroken, highly subtle physical connection throughout the entire, excruciating evening. Currently, David sat upon the heavy mahogany throne, his broad shoulders squared, his posture projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Luna stood just to his right, her hand resting lightly, seemingly casually, on the back of his chair. But hidden beneath the drape of the dark velvet upholstery, her thumb maintained a firm, steady, and unyielding pressure against the heated skin of his wrist. The invisible, resonant current flowing between them was the only barrier holding back the toxic, agonizing effects of the refined aconite still lingering deep in his cellular structure. They had removed the poisoned soil from the conservatory, cutting off the source. But the residual damage in his bloodstream was currently warring violently with the ancestral call of the moon. Every time the heavy, crimson light shifted across David's stoic face, Luna could feel the subtle, terrifying micro-tremors of pain vibrating through his pulse. The beast within him was thrashing blindly, confused by the intense lunar pull and the unnatural, suppressing fog of the remaining poison. Yet, his outward facade remained devastatingly composed. He nodded politely to the minor territorial alphas, who cautiously approached the dais to offer their ceremonial tributes. His amber eyes were incredibly sharp, cataloging every shifting alliance in the room, missing absolutely nothing. He was waiting. They both were. They knew, with cold, mathematical certainty, that Elder Vance would not let the absolute zenith of the blood moon pass without executing his final, devastating play. Right on cue. As the massive, antique grandfather clock in the grand foyer began to solemnly chime the midnight hour, the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom swung wide open. The low hum of polite conversation instantly died out, replaced by a suffocating, deeply expectant silence. Elder Vance strode into the center of the room, flanked intimately by Seraphina and a phalanx of 4 heavily armed, imposing guards, fiercely loyal to his eastern territory. His silver eyes gleamed with a malevolent, triumphant light as he stopped directly in front of the royal dais, completely ignoring standard pack protocol by blatantly refusing to bow his head. The sheer, unprecedented audacity of the disrespect sent a low, collective gasp rippling through the crowded ballroom. "Your Majesty," Vance boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent, breathless expanse. He projected a carefully manufactured, highly theatrical tone of deep, sorrowful regret. "It breaks my heart to violently disrupt such a sacred, ancestral gathering. However, as the senior voice of the Council of Elders, I am bound by blood and ancient law to prioritize the ultimate safety of the pack over the comforting, fragile illusions of decorum." He paused, pivoting slowly to gesture broadly to the hushed, anxious crowd, playing them like a master conductor. "Just last night, a feral wolf, a creature completely broken by madness and rot, breached our supposedly secure inner borders and was slaughtered merely feet from the royal chambers. Our physical defenses are failing, our borders are crumbling, and the dark, terrifying rumors regarding the instability of the royal bloodline can absolutely no longer be ignored." Luna felt David's pulse aggressively spike beneath her thumb, a rapid, dangerous drumbeat of suppressed, violent fury. The dark, spiderweb veins of the curse faintly flickered at the edge of his crisp white collar, dangerously agitated by Vance's deliberate, calculating provocation. Luna pressed her thumb down harder, desperately flooding her quiet, grounding energy into his system, sending an unspoken plea for him to hold the line. The true battle for the throne had officially begun. David did not immediately rise to the bait. He remained seated, his powerful hands gripping the carved armrests of the throne, with enough force to make the ancient wood quietly groan. He let Vance's theatrical echo fade entirely into the vaulted ceiling before he spoke. "You speak eloquently of broken borders and failing defenses, Elder Vance," David replied, his voice a low, lethal purr that vibrated menacingly through the polished floorboards. "Yet, you conveniently omit the profound, highly terrifying question of how a rabid creature managed to completely bypass your specific eastern sector's security checkpoints. I strongly advise you to proceed with tremendous caution. You are currently walking a razor's edge." Vance simply smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth that held absolutely no warmth. "I am walking the undeniable path of salvation, David. The pack requires a true, uncorrupted king, and I intend to legally prove, before the light of the moon and the spirits of our ancestors, that you are fundamentally no longer fit to bear that immense title." The crimson light in the grand ballroom seemed to supernaturally intensify, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble as Elder Vance raised his right hand. He was tightly clutching an ancient, deeply weathered scroll bound in tarnished silver wire. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted entirely. The collective breath of the Silverwood pack caught in their throats. Every single wolf present fundamentally understood the terrifying, historical gravity of the document Vance held. It was not a mere political petition. It was a legally binding execution of absolute power. By the ancient, irrefutable laws of our founders, drafted in the blood of the first Alphas, Vance declared, his voice echoing with a zealot-like fervor. I formally invoke the right of regency. I call for the immediate, forced abdication of Alpha King David. On the absolute visible grounds of genetic degradation, mental instability, and the undeniable manifestation of the ancient blood curse. A deafening chorus of shocked, panicked whispers erupted from the surrounding crowd. Seizing the chaotic momentum, Seraphina stepped forward. Her chin was tilted high, casting a look of triumphant, profound disdain toward Luna, before turning to address the pack with the manufactured aura of a benevolent savior. My uncle speaks only the tragic, necessary truth, Seraphina announced smoothly, her voice ringing like crystal. The king is severely compromised by his biology. I, as a pure-blooded highborn, am fully prepared to step into the role of regent queen alongside a newly appointed alpha, to swiftly guide this pack back to stability, tradition, and honor. The audacity of the orchestrated coup was breathtaking in its surgical precision. Vance was banking entirely on the specific, amplified pull of the blood moon to forcefully drag the physical symptoms of the aconite poisoning to the surface, thereby publicly validating his treasonous claims of genetic failure. And for a terrifying, agonizing moment, his lethal gambles seemed to be working, as the lunar zenith fully aligned with the open skylights. A violent, highly visible shudder racked David's broad frame. The faint, dark veins hiding beneath his collar violently surged upward. They crawled like black, toxic ivy across his strong jawline, creeping dangerously close to his glowing amber eyes. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the ballroom as the absolute visual proof of the fabled curse was undeniably presented to the terrified pack. Vance's smile widened into a victorious, ugly sneer. "Behold the tragic reality," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the dais. "The madness takes him. Guards, seize the sovereign for his own protection." The 4 Eastern guards stepped forward, their hands dropping to the heavy, silver-plated batons at their hips. But before their boots could even touch the first step of the dais, a massive, unmovable wall of muscle and scarred authority violently blocked their path. Captain Silas stood at the base of the stairs, his ice-blue eyes burning with lethal intent, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his ceremonial broadsword. "Take one more step toward the king," Silas warned, his voice dangerously soft, "and I will personally decorate this marble with your entrails." David finally stood up. The sheer, terrifying power of the movement caused the entire front row of the crowd to take an involuntary step backward. His breathing was incredibly ragged, the blackened veins stark and horrifying against his pale skin. But his mind remained devastatingly, brilliantly clear. He turned his head slightly, his amber gaze locking onto Luna. It was the signal. Luna stepped out from behind the throne, moving directly to the very edge of the dais. She didn't cower, and she didn't attempt to hide her humanity. She reached into the bodice of her silk gown and pulled out a small, highly compressed digital drive, holding it aloft. "Elder Vance is not attempting to save this pack." Luna's voice rang out, shockingly clear and steady, cutting flawlessly through the panic. "He is actively, methodically attempting to murder your king. She turned to the crowd, projecting absolute, irrefutable confidence. This drive contains the undeniable, decrypted financial manifests linking Vance's Eastern shell companies to massive shipments of refined aconite. The curse you see is not genetic. It is an artificially induced, highly sophisticated poison secretly laced into the soil of the royal estate by the very man claiming to be your savior. The grand ballroom instantly descended into a state of absolute, chaotic uproar. Vance's face drained of all color, his triumphant sneer briefly collapsing into genuine, frantic panic before his deeply ingrained political survival instincts kicked in. "Lies!" Vance roared, pointing wildly at Luna, his voice booming over the din. She is a human spy. A pathetic, scentless liar manipulating the fractured mind of a dying wolf. You expect the noble Silverwood Pact to abandon our sacred laws over a piece of fabricated human technology? He turned his furious gaze back to David. If you are truly a king, David, you will prove your strength the old way. I invoke the trial by combat, my champion against you here and now. If you fall, you forfeit the crown, and your human pet burns for her treason. A hushed, terrified silence fell over the room. The trial by combat was the oldest, most brutal law in existence. To refuse it was an automatic admission of guilt and weakness. Vance gestured sharply, and a towering, massively built wolf from his guard stepped forward, shrugging off his formal jacket. He was a mountain of muscle, fresh and untouched by poison. David, conversely, was actively trembling as the lunar zenith fiercely aggravated the residual aconite in his veins. "David, no," Luna whispered, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs as she looked at the dark veins mapping his neck. "The poison." "I have to, Luna," David replied softly, his voice a ragged rasp. A pack will never follow a king who hides behind a ledger when challenged with blood. He gently pulled his wrist from her grasp, instantly severing the grounding connection. The physical toll was immediate. David swayed slightly as he descended the marble stairs, the toxic fire roaring back to life in his system. The crowd formed a wide, terrified circle in the center of the ballroom. Silas looked ready to murder Vance himself, but the ancient laws bound his hands. The fight began with explosive, brutal speed. Vance's champion lunged, a terrifying blur of lethal intent. David met the attack with the ingrained, devastating skill of an apex predator. He blocked a crushing blow and countered with a strike to the champion's ribs that cracked bone loudly in the silent room. But as David pivoted, the dark veins on his neck flared violently under the crimson light. His muscles seized momentarily, a lethal hesitation caused entirely by the poison. The champion capitalized instantly, landing a devastating blow to David's chest that sent the Alpha King crashing heavily onto the polished marble. Luna's breath stopped entirely. The human logic she had relied on her entire life, the ledgers, the audits, the carefully constructed plans, was completely useless in this brutal, visceral reality. She realized, with a sudden, blinding clarity, that the fated mate bond wasn't merely meant to act as a temporary battery to suppress pain. It was a complete, biological circuit. It required absolute, unprotected exposure. Completely abandoning all protocol and self-preservation, Luna ran down the marble steps. She pushed past the stunned royal guards, breaking the sacred perimeter of the combat circle just as the champion raised his fist for a final, lethal strike. She threw herself to her knees beside David, slamming both of her bare hands flat against his chest, directly over his violently racing heart. The resulting physical connection did not just suppress the pain. It triggered a massive, explosive biological resonance. A blinding, pure wave of brilliant energy visibly rippled outward from where her hands met his skin, hitting the surrounding crowd with a wave of profound, calming warmth that completely eclipsed the heavy crimson light of the moon. Right before the wide, terrified eyes of the entire council, the blackened, poisoned veins on David's skin didn't just recede, they violently evaporated. The toxic fog that had plagued him for a year was entirely incinerated by the absolute, grounding purity of the fated mate bond. David drew in a massive, deep breath, his amber eyes snapping open, blazing with a clear, flawless, and completely uncorrupted power. He moved with a speed that defied logic. In one fluid, devastating motion, he rose to his feet, catching the champion's descending fist mid-air, and effortlessly twisted the massive man to the ground, pinning him completely with a low, earth-shattering snarl of absolute dominance. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, ringing loudly in the ears of everyone present. The myth was real. It was breathing, standing brilliantly before them. Slowly, starting from the back of the room, the minor alphas dropped to their knees, exposing their necks in profound, absolute reverence. The rest of the pack followed in a massive, synchronized wave of submission, until only Vance and Seraphina were left standing, completely surrounded by a sea of kneeling wolves. "Captain Silas," David commanded, his voice perfectly clear, rich and vibrating with absolute sovereignty. "Arrest Elder Vance for high treason. Throw him in the subterranean cells. Let him rot in the very dark he tried to bury me in." As Silas and his guards forcefully dragged the screaming, desperate elder and his horrified niece from the room, David turned his attention entirely back to Luna. He ignored the kneeling crowd, stepping over the defeated champion to reach her. He dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to her level, his large, warm hands gently cupping her face. The stoic mask of the king was completely gone. He looked at her with the quiet, profound reverence of a man who had just been handed back his entire universe. "You stepped into the circle," he murmured, his voice incredibly soft, thick with an emotion that stole her breath. "You are the most terrifying, magnificent creature I have ever known." Luna leaned heavily into his touch, a small, genuine smile curving her lips as a wave of immense relief washed over her. "We simply balanced the ledgers, David," she whispered, looking into his clear, beautiful eyes. "The truth just needed a little bit of light." The harrowing journey from the forgotten, dusty archives of the Silverwood estate to the very pinnacle of the royal throne fundamentally proves that true strength doesn't always rely on brute force. Sometimes it takes a brilliant mind reading the ledgers, finding the truth, and holding the line in the absolute darkest of storms. By breaking the ancient curse through the undeniable power of the fated mate bond, and dismantling a deeply entrenched political conspiracy, David and Luna permanently shifted the balance of power, proving that the most profound, unbreakable bonds are forged in the intense fires of absolute adversity. Thank you so much for accompanying David and Luna through the treacherous, thrilling world of the Silverwood Pack. If you were captivated by their undeniable chemistry, the high-stakes political intrigue, and their ultimate hard-won victory, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more dramatic, romantic stories, and let us know in the comments what kind of magical romances you would love to see us bring to life next.